Welcome to Baltic World. I'm Charlene.
I'm Crispin.
This is our week in review. Baltic World is a channel where we discuss important issues facing Northern, Central, and Eastern Europe. Oh, it feels so good to say that again. It's been a while.
Yes, we have been in other parts of the world. I, as people know, finally contracted COVID and was recovering. Charlene had it before we went to
our
Europe.
trip. Yeah, I just can't believe that you went to like 7 countries and didn't get it. Came back to Australia, got COVID.
Straight away, yeah. I went to help a friend work on his boat and got it instantly. And a really good time to catch it, though, actually. I didn't have much planned. I was trying to settle back in. Wasn't intending to do much after a very hectic period of time. So it was a good opportunity to just sort of lay in bed. But it is a strange disease. I found it to be a little bit unlike anything I'd had before. Right. A good comparison is like the flu. Most of you will have had it, so I'm probably just preaching to people who have had experience, and everyone's experience is different. However, comparing it with the flu, I find if you have a bad influenza, it's so much worse in terms of the symptoms. You know, your terrible headaches, burning fevers, horrible muscle aches. And you can really start to worry about yourself. You're like, okay, this is starting to get scary. But then when you turn a corner, when the fever breaks, when your headache starts to alleviate, when you can kind of clear up the sinuses a little bit, things just progressively get better from there. You're like, okay, I'm getting better. I feel better. Things are going back to normal. And then a couple of days later, you're totally fine. Whereas I found with COVID is I'd start to feel a bit better. So much so that I'd be like, okay, yeah, I'll make some plans and maybe you'd be able to do things. And then an hour after that, I'll be back in bed, like, groveling. So the symptoms were never as intense as a bad influenza gets, but it was very much a seesaw. And you mentioned, the symptoms cycle through.
Yeah, I feel like my symptoms cycle through. So like initially when I had it, I just started with a really high fever. And then that lasted for a few hours. And then suddenly that just stopped out of nowhere. And then, came the headache after that. And then once that stopped, then came, I don't know, like coughing. And it was just like progressively different symptoms.
Yeah. Oh. Well, my cough was never that bad, but I got really cold. I was in the shower 5 times a day just trying to warm up. I was shivering all the time. So that was a strange thing for me. And people at home, if you've had the disease, let us know some of your unusual symptoms. Because I do find that every person I speak to, even if it's the same variant, people had wildly different experiences. I think in part also if you've been vaccinated, the type of vaccine that you've had probably has an impact on the way the disease progresses as well, because it affects the way your immune system responds. I don't know. I'm spitballing here, but I did find that people had very different experiences from one another. I was pleased that even when I was sick, I could still eat.
Some people have no appetite, and I was like, come on, bring it in. Oh, it's so good. But apart from that, how are you going? Like, you kind of left the country quickly.
I did. So my favorite place to play poker in the world is Manila. And we are starting up a second channel called Poker Room Review for people who play live poker, go to casinos around the world, thinking of going on a holiday, and they want to go play poker where they're on holiday to get a sense of what the poker scene is like in the possible destinations they go to. And Manila will be our test case. It'll take a while for us to release our videos because unlike Baltic World, where first of all it's our first love and we pay more attention to it, but also because it's so responsive to the news and things that are happening, it's a constant update for people. Whereas Poker Room Review will be very much the same format for each episode. So we'll do an episode at X location in Y city, and it'll cover things like how much it costs, the different options, getting there, all of those things, and we'll be providing a rating. So what we'll do is we'll film multiple different episodes and release them on a schedule. So it's a very different style of filmmaking for YouTube. So that's one thing that's coming up. But I went to Manila, and the reason for that is the poker there is fantastic, except for one massive drawback, which is that they have smoking on the casino floors. Now, Australians don't smoke really at all. There's a lot of reasons for that.
It's surprising when we went to Europe just how frequent we saw smoking. I was like, wow.
Yeah, smoking is almost a thing of the past in Australia. And if you come to Australia, it's not a great place to go if you are a smoker, because we won't even say how much. We might as well. How much is a packet of cigarettes in Australia?
I don't even know, like $50?
Yeah, 50 Australian, so about $35 US. Now, if you're like coughing up on your Mentos when you hear that figure, that's because our taxes are vastly high, and they're going up 10% per year, basically compounding. So that's why it's so expensive.
Yeah, and I remember, because it was widely available in Europe, of course, we fly back into Australia, and that's the last time you get tax-free things, and one of them is cigarettes. So we had this person in front of us trying to buy cigarettes, but I think it was limited to 2 packets per person.
Yeah,
so you had to
very small number.
Yeah, and you had to have a friend or whatever if you wanted to buy more. Thing is, right, the cabinet was locked. So the guy actually had to go to a different room, grab the key and unlock the cigarette. That's how, like, infrequent Australians smoke.
It's not a thing.
No.
So, yeah, I mean, I recommend Australia as a great travel destination for just about anyone in the world. The weather is beautiful. The scenery is amazing. You can go places where just no one has ever been. But if you come as a smoker, you're not going to have a great time. It's going to be too expensive. The restrictions are very severe. There aren't many places you can even buy them, let alone be allowed to smoke them. So just keep that in mind. It's a great place if you want to quit, though. If you're coming to Australia, if you're like, okay, I want to quit, I need a destination that'll help you do that, come to Australia, because it's a great place to get away from it all.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Manila, they have smoking on the casino floor, not at the table, but all around you.
Yeah.
And after a day of that, it's too much. Like, it just smells so bad. It's like I'm coughing, I feel sick. And I'm like, how could I possibly do this day in, day out? Even though it's a place that I absolutely love to play this game. And I was telling everybody that I know, it was like, look, the day that they stop smoking at the poker, I'm going to be there. And anyway, so I was in Europe, and a friend sent me a message on Telegram. Now, this is a friend that isn't on Facebook or has no social media presence. And he sent me a message, and I'm like, wow, if he's sending me a message, it must be important. He sent it to me on Telegram, and I was with Charlene at the time.
Yeah, we're going to a bus. I remember this.
And he said, I just thought you should know, I'm in Manila for a poker series, and they have moved the poker to a non-smoking floor of the casino. So there I am dancing in front of traffic, people not really understanding what this crazy guy's doing.
What is he doing?
And so as soon as the trip ended, I came back for a couple of days and flew off again, which is why I was there. And yeah, it's heaven on earth to play poker there. I thoroughly recommend it. If you're into poker, you can wait for the Poker Room Review series, but a bit of a spoiler alert, the Resorts World of Manila is a great place to be.
For sure. All right, moving back to the Baltic. There's a lot of things that's happening. So I had no idea, but Lithuanians proved another thing. You can crowdfund like military drones.
Well, apparently, yes. And this is not something that has happened before.
Like at all?
I don't think so. It's the high-end military equipment, which is what this drone clearly is, has always been the preserve of governments. That countries put in strong export controls to say you can't sell your product to these countries or to private citizens or non-state actors. And we're going to keep this technology in the hands of people that are allies, people that we specifically approve. And so to have someone come along and say, hey, let's crowdfund a drone, and not only that, get the approval of all the governments involved, is an extraordinarily difficult thing. So Andrius Tapinas managed to do this. He is the founder and CEO of, and I'm going to mispronounce it, Laisvės TV, a Lithuanian television station. They're the number one sort of content creator on the Contribui site, where you can support us as well, but you'll definitely see them if you go to the Contribui website. And in a space of a few days, raised 5.5 million euros, remembering that Lithuania is a country of only 3 million people. So every man, woman and child donated €3 roughly on average in the space of a couple of days, which shows you the level of grassroots commitment that the people of Lithuania have for the Ukrainians. But there is an epilogue to this story. So the Turkish government, the Turkish defense industries, were so impressed that this happened, and it got worldwide coverage. So I'm not the only one reporting on it. Andreas has been doing interviews all around the world, including in the Australian press. And the Turkish defense industries decided to donate the drone. They said, look, how about we just give you the drone and you take that money you've raised and put it to humanitarian aid or some other support for Ukraine, mostly because they were impressed by what the Lithuanians had done, but also it had given them millions and millions of dollars worth of free publicity. They everyone around the world knows about this drone, and so they're getting orders left, right, and center. New countries are signing up to purchase them. So they just got a lot of press. And
if everyone has the same drone, doesn't it become more ineffective, or I just don't know how drones work?
Well, again, these countries have strong restrictions on who receives them, so it's not like everybody can purchase a Bayraktar drone. The drone itself has proven itself effective in multiple theaters. It first came to prominence in the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, depending on what side you're on there, you might have mixed feelings about it, but the Turkish government strongly supported Azerbaijan in that conflict, and the drones were a game changer. It was something that Armenia just could not match or resist. And the drone has proven effective against Russian armor, not only in Ukraine, but also in Libya, where a lot of Soviet-era weaponry, heavy armor was employed, and the Bayraktar drone destroyed a lot of that equipment. So it's a highly lethal and effective weapon. Anyway, so the Turkish industry is donating this drone. They're fast tracking its production, so it'll be within a couple of weeks, it'll be fielded out there. And Andreas Tarpanis has been consulting the people that have donated to say, look, what should we do with the money? It's basically been agreed that 1.5 million euros will go to Lithuania's defense industry to arm the drone, because what they had just purchased was an unarmed drone, and Ukrainians would have to put the weapons on it itself. They're like, oh, we'll put the weapons on it. And so the rest of the money will be used to support Ukraine's defense in other ways. Andreas Tarpanis is consulting with various military experts on what Ukraine needs and how that money could be best be spent. And so he has put out a crowdsourced request to name the drone that they're getting. And I've put up a word.
What do you put?
The Caucus, as in named after the pagan Lithuanian house servant. It's a mythical creature that serves a household in old Baltic medieval period. And so I was like, call it the Caucus, the servant of the Ukrainians living in that era. I don't know if it's going to make the top list. There are I think what's happening is Andreas is going to choose the 20 most popular words, and people can vote on that list. And then I assume whatever gets the most votes wins. The Turkish defense industries are painting the drone Lithuanian colors and giving it all kind of Lithuanian feel. So when it's flying over the skies of Ukraine, it'll have a certain crowdsourced branding, if you like, and a crowdsourced name. And perhaps we'll be able to follow its progress. And see, if it is effective in combat. And in terms of the way the money's spent, I also provided a suggestion on how it could be used. The Taiwanese government has just fielded a new anti-tank weapon. It's a single-use weapon called the Kestrel. It's only 5 kilograms, right? It is insanely light, meaning that ordinary soldiers could carry one who are non-specialists. You don't need to be an anti-tank specialist. You could just be an ordinary soldier, and it can be used against armor. It can also be used against fortifications. It's effectively a a highly penetrating explosive rocket-propelled grenade.
Yeah.
And I think the Taiwanese government, which is looking to support Lithuania in all kinds of ways, I'm sure would give a significant discount if the Lithuanian government went to Taiwan and said, look, we would like to purchase the Kestrel for Ukrainian forces. And I think the Taiwanese would appreciate seeing the weapon used in battlefield conditions and be stress tested in real life scenarios, because they're going to really rely on these kind of weapons should China ever invade Taiwan. These are the kinds of things that are going to be game changers. They need to know it works. So I think there would be a great opportunity there. Obviously, this is not up to me. It's up to Andreas, who has made this extraordinary effort to raise this money. But that would be my suggestion. Go to Taiwan and see what they suggest, because you get a lot of bang for your buck. The Taiwanese government will give big discounts for Lithuania, I'm sure. They'll want to see these weapon systems and platforms tested in real life conditions. And it's extremely light and versatile, easy to use for ordinary Ukrainians who may not have the training in using anti-tank weapons. They don't need much for this. There's a couple of buttons and bang, away you go. Wow. So that's my suggestion. You can always go to Andreas's Facebook page and give your support to that idea, or put up your own. Yeah, no, for sure. And then obviously it's Taiwan, right? So like in terms of foreign policy and relations, like it makes sense. Particularly with that, okay, right. So I've been following this for a while, and there's been a call across the board of just peacekeeping. Like, is that a way? Like, is there any room for negotiation to, negotiate a peace deal at all? Because I'm a bit fed up. Okay, honestly, I understand with all these weapons, and I'm really proud of the Lithuanians for raising this kind of money, and protecting the sovereignty of Ukraine, but it's just ridiculous, right? Why can't anything be negotiated? Well, there is a strong humanitarian argument that the people that are suffering most in this conflict are ordinary people, right? That whatever the egotistic dream of Vladimir Putin, the fact is that there is carnage on the ground, and putting aside the right and the wrongs of it, stopping that bloodshed has its own moral force, okay? But if you're in Ukraine's position, this was a totally unprovoked invasion. And we have people like Emmanuel Macron of France saying that we have to not humiliate Russia. We can't put Russia into a corner. We have to have a negotiated solution where Russia comes away with something and Ukraine can offer something symbolic, so that the Russian military can say that it was worth all the death and destruction at some level, and we can go back to a situation of peace, similar to what it was prior to the war. Now, I think this is incredibly short-sighted. I can understand the human desire to stop the fighting, to stop the killing, and I think it's a small comfort if you are in that part of the world to continue fighting, knowing that things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. But we have to remember why this conflict happened. Okay, the Russian argument is that it's because NATO continued to expand, and that Russia was being humiliated after the Cold War, and its weakness was taken advantage of, and that Russian speakers in other parts of Europe, including Ukraine, are persecuted. And there is some element of truth to some of those complaints. But that is not why the war began. The war started because Vladimir Putin had delusions of restoring the Russian Empire, to go back to its 17th century borders, to be the centerpiece of Slavic culture and Orthodox Christianity in the world. And Ukraine, in Vladimir Putin's mind, isn't even a legitimate country. And he made that perfectly clear in his recorded videos prior to the war, videos that were very long, where he went into considerable detail about his motivation And a motivation, I believe, because it was quite open in his aspiration.
I do wonder why he thought Russia was ready, I guess. 'Cause it doesn't look like it was ready at all for this kind of conflict.
Well, actually, this is probably one of the most understandable mistakes. Everybody thought that Ukraine would fall rapidly. The American strategy was to train up an insurgency outside the borders of Ukraine once Ukraine was taken over. Everyone thought that Russia would just roll in, take Kiev, the government would fall. But every assumption about that has been proven wrong, to the great glory of the Ukrainian people and Ukrainian culture. So, for example, it all started when Zelensky said, "I don't need a ride. The fight is here. I need ammunition." Okay. It was assumed that because Zelensky was unpopular in Ukraine, as soon as Russia kicked in the door, Zelensky would fall or flee. And he did neither. Okay. Then it was assumed that there would be considerable discord within Europe, that there would be a great deal of conflict and argument about how to respond, and that there would be no unity on things like sanctions and supporting Ukraine militarily and all of that. And all this proved totally false. The Europeans all came together and united. The sanctions on Russia were more far-reaching and more severe than Russia ever imagined. Yeah. Ukraine's defense was incredibly valiant and robust, and so Russia suffered staggering losses initially. The Russian military was not prepared for the heavy campaign that was required to meet its military objectives. And the West has become invigorated by this conflict and seek to attain total victory. So Russia has radically circumscribed its original goals and is focusing on the east of the country, where things are predominantly Russian speaking, close to Russia's borders, supply lines are much shorter. And this is much more in line with Russia's military capability. It does mean that the conflict does enter a new phase. And this is part of what is driving the new push to get a negotiated solution, because a lot of people don't believe that Ukraine can, on its own, defeat Russia's military in a straight-up conventional fight over east of the country, which is heavily occupied by Russian forces, being entrenched, being reinforced. It's one thing, for example, to defend your major cities that are far from Russia's borders, with a population that is committed to freedom and liberty and resisting foreign domination. In an urban environment where Russia's principal military advantages of heavy armor, air superiority are diminished. So if you're in an urban jungle surrounded by buildings, well, the tanks and the aircraft aren't as useful. And if you've got a population that is against you, it's very hard to go door to door and clear them out when you've got snipers literally everywhere. So defending the cities was where Ukraine's military advantage lay, because they had a committed population who are determined to resist. It's a different story when you're across very flat terrain against heavy armored divisions with Russia's principal advantage, which is its artillery. It's an artillery-based army with air superiority. That's a big ask. However, it is doable. And given that Russia is hemmed in the east, that there is universal support, essentially in the West, helping Ukraine, what you need to do is just build up Ukraine's conventional forces such as it can take the fight to Russia. There are two things that concern me, though. One is President Biden is lukewarm about this. He's clearly afraid of giving Ukraine weapon systems that could potentially be used to attack Russia. Okay?
What do you mean by that?
Well, he isn't giving long-range missiles to the Ukrainians. So one thing that Ukraine desperately needs is weapon systems that can outrange Russian artillery. That is something that only America can provide. Okay, but the problem is, if you give Ukraine those kinds of systems, then potentially Ukraine could use them to attack cities in Russia. Okay. And Biden is afraid that doing so will escalate the conflict such that Russia may be inclined to use nuclear weapons in the conflict. May see that America's open support for Ukraine in providing the most advanced weapon systems available would mean that Russia would feel it had to escalate.
But everyone sees this as a proxy war anyway.
That's true. And I think Biden is he's a bit of a bedwetter about this. Like that we shouldn't be afraid of Russia. Yes, Russia has nuclear weapons, and yes, it has incentive to use them under certain circumstances. But Russia has brought this on itself, and Putin knows this. And if Ukraine needs to attack Russia because that's where Russian weapons are firing, then so be it. So I would support limitations to say, look, you can't just go and bomb Volgograd or Moscow or something like that. But if there's artillery being fired across the border, then, well, that's where the attacks are coming from. It's entirely legitimate to attack those targets. And Ukraine needs the long-range weapon systems in order to do that. Yeah. And the US should be providing them, no questions asked. Now, the other thing that I'm worried about is people like Emmanuel Macron, who think that in an incredibly short-sighted way, that the solution to this is to give Russia an out, to say, okay, they have to come away from this war with something. And to be fair, that's what the Russians are kind of saying. The Russians that I've been dealing with have said, look, we know that the war is a disaster, right? They wouldn't say that in public company, but behind closed doors with enough vodka, they're like, look, this is not something that we intended to end up in. Yeah. And we are looking for an out. Okay. But what we need to say is that we have defended the Russian speakers in the east of Ukraine. If we can do that, then we can stop the war and go back to peace. And Emmanuel Macron is rushing headlong for that option. What I would say is that the humiliation isn't about Russia's military defeat. It's about what happens after that. So right now, every effort should be used to turn the screws on the Russian army and have them defeated utterly. Kick them out of Ukraine entirely, provide Ukraine with all the weapon systems and support it needs to be able to do that. But once Russia has been defeated, then we open the door and say, if you want to be welcomed back into the community of European nations, we're willing to talk about that under these conditions. But
what's going to if Russia suffers utter defeat, what prevents them just running off with China?
Well, that's what gives us the incentive to leave the door open.
Okay.
Because if we slam the door shut, there is no situation under which Russia has any global strategic option other than to become Beijing's slave. And if it does that, then it will cost Europe in the long run. If we look at what Russia has incurred, they were saying, we don't want to see NATO expanded. That's why we need to fight this war. So it invited exactly that. Sweden and Finland are joining NATO despite Turkey's obstinacy. I'm sure that'll be overcome in due course. And as a consequence, Russia's border with NATO has expanded 1,300 kilometers. It's brought about exactly the outcome it's seeking to avoid. So it's already achieved a strategic disaster. But what needs to happen is Russia needs to be broken of this imperial ambition, this dream that it can restore a greater Russia, because that's not going to happen. And we're seeing new alliances and coalitions form. So Britain, Poland, the Nordic countries, the Baltic states, they're creating almost a new alliance, a new NATO within NATO, essentially to prevent any Russian resurgence. We're seeing an emerging Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth being reintroduced, where Lithuania and Poland, their relationship is much improved. The Ukrainians in the West, which were part of that territory once, supporting Poland more and more. Slavic culture and identity is moving away from Moscow to Kiev and Warsaw. And eventually the Belarusians will break free of Lukashenko. Lukashenko is getting old. The pressure on the Belarusians to pull away from Russia's orbit will grow and that we might see another revolution there.
Yeah.
So Russia's strategic situation is collapsing around it as a consequence of its own invasion. However, once Russia has been broken of this dream wherein they can impose their will on Eastern Europe, that is no longer possible. And say, look, we're not going to have a Russian empire ever again. However, we still recognize that you're a European country with a European history, and you're part of the West, essentially, even if there are things that you like to keep separate socially. You are a Western country. You are a European nation. And these wounds can be healed. And you can be part of civilization that ultimately defeats China. And if we can have that dialogue, then eventually, maybe, I'm not saying it's above 50%, but it's worth a shot.
Yeah.
We can bring Russia into the European family.
It's really difficult though, because obviously the United States is part of NATO, and there's this anti-Russian sentiment that runs through.
Yes, and
so I don't know how this relationship will be able to heal, even if Russia is defeated.
Oh, of course. So there's the anti-Russia feeling in the Baltic countries, in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, which is, historically so similar to Russia, and of course the United States. So you're absolutely right. But strategically, we have an incentive to do that. I think deep down in the Russian soul, they recognize that it's a pretty bleak future to be just China's plaything, and to have no other friends in the world. That's not a future that's good for many Russians. But also in the United States, a lot of anti-Russia sentiment is due to domestic politics. And it all comes down to Trump. So in 2016, Trump gets elected. And the Democrats, rather than asking the question why, they could not believe that Donald Trump could be president of the United States legitimately. They did not understand the Rust Belt. They didn't understand those states that had flipped from Democrat to Republican. They put it down to two things: racism and Russia.
Russian interference.
Now, the racism thing was incredibly dumb. There were 3,000 counties that had voted for Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012 that switched to Trump in 2016. 3,000 counties. It's a kind of a strange type of racism if they suddenly go from the black president to Trump. That doesn't make much sense, okay? The other thing was, yes, as you say, Russian interference. And in doing so, they made it out like Vladimir Putin controlled the United States. You see that time cover where the White House was turning red bricks as if it was the Kremlin. Insane. Absolutely total lack of introspection. And then you had the Mueller investigations.
Nothing.
Trump impeachment processes. It's just absurd. There was nothing in it.
Twice. Was that a thing?
He got impeached twice, yeah. It was beyond crazy. And I think that made Russia seem so much bigger and more powerful than it actually is, and only on one side of politics. Because what it did with the Republicans is it pushed them closer to be sympathetic to Russia. And that, one of the reasons we see some Trump Republicans voting against supporting Ukraine is not because they're pro-Russia or anti-Ukraine. They don't like spending open-ended checks on foreign wars. They remember Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, all of that. But also because they are deeply skeptical now of anything Democrats support, particularly when it comes to things that are anti-Russia, because they see it in the lens of domestic politics in the United States. Now, that's not correct in this case. Ukraine is not an American foreign policy adventure. It's a country that is defending itself against an invasion.
Yeah. And
Biden, many things to criticize about Biden, but one thing that he is to be commended for is he did try to stop the war. I mean, one thing that the Biden administration did extremely effectively was control the narrative in the lead up to war. They said, yes, this is happening. They made everything they could public. They let everybody know ahead of time what Russia was planning to do in various ways. So Russia could never pretend that it was reacting to Ukrainian aggression. It was like, yes, Ukraine attacked us and therefore we were invaded. No, the Americans preempted that extremely effectively. They said, look, Russia's trying all these disinformation campaigns, false flag operations. This is exactly what Russia is doing. And it was proven over and over again. The one country that got this wrong was France, which said that they didn't think that Putin was ever going to invade. And now that they have invaded, Macron's the apologist who's like, yeah, we don't want to humiliate Russia. It's such an embarrassment. I mean, I thought I'd be most critical of the Germans here because of Nord Stream 2, but France, the French government, not the French people, I would make a big separation there. The French people have really opened their arms to the Ukrainians.
Yes.
But the French government, Macron, has just debased himself in front of the whole world. He's rightly being criticised by the Baltic leaderships. I think of Kaja Kallas, the Prime Minister of Estonia, who's like, look, why do you keep calling Putin? Putin is supposed to be isolated. All you do by calling him is let him know he's not isolated. And then the things that he says, that Ukraine has to compromise on its territory to support and not humiliate Russia. If he's so concerned about that, give Russia some French territory, right? Then you won't humiliate Russia, will you? You'll be able to appease Vladimir Putin and convince the Russian people that they came away with something because they took New Caledonia or something. Like give them Nice or something, right? And then the Russians can have their yachts that have been impounded, in the nice Mediterranean ports on the south of France. As part of Russian territory. That's my suggestion for Macron. See how it feels.
Okay, sure thing. Oh my goodness. I want to bring it back more locally. So Australia just recently had a federal election. Yeah. And it's flipped. So we've moved from Liberal to the Labor government. And there's been a big argument. One of the things that has been brought about is foreign policy position between Liberal and Labor. It was really prominent in our last government that we followed the US in a lot of ways. And now there's new hope for us to have an independent foreign policy rather than a US dependent foreign policy. What do you think about that?
That's a great question. So first of all, the Liberal Party in Australia is not like the liberals in the United States. There are conservatives. Okay, so think of Labor Party and Conservative in Britain. It's Labor Party and Liberal Party in Australia. Liberal Party being the Conservatives. So just for our international audience. So it's gone from a Conservative government to a centre-left government. And there are multiple interesting facets of foreign policy in this respect. So the biggest difference between the two in foreign policy is the Liberal government, which I'll just call the Conservatives going forward to stop the confusion. The Conservatives are bilateral focused in their foreign policy. So they'll go to Indonesia, they'll go to Saudi Arabia, to Washington, D.C., and they'll have bilateral agreements, free trade agreements, treaties. Whereas the Labor government is much more focused on multilateralism. So climate summits, dealing with ASEAN, dealing with the EU, and like to have agreements that cross multiple different parties rather than have direct things. And one of the suspicions thereof is alliances because they tend to be bilateral, particularly in the Australian context. And there's always been a strong push within the Labor Party to be more distinct from Washington. And their argument runs that Australia, yes, it has a European history, but geographically it's in Asia. And that makes us unique in the world. Yeah. No two neighbours are as different as Australia and Indonesia, right? And yet we still wed ourselves to the Queen and the British monarchy, and we have this very Eurocentric thing. We're part of Eurovision, for goodness sake.
Oh, Eurovision was so good as a side note. So while you were away, I was watching Eurovision, and I think, this is such a side note, Latvia was stolen. Like, honestly, their vegetable song was a great hit. And obviously Lithuania,
Oh, so Latvia got robbed. I hear that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, they were so robbed. Like, I was thinking, how did they not make the final? But that's okay. We had it. We had Estonia.
I want some drinks, though.
You did?
Yeah, so I bet somebody, before the war began, in Ukraine. This is, but I could feel the tension rising. I said, look, if any other country other than Ukraine wins Eurovision, I will cough up 3 drinks. If Ukraine wins, I'm owed 3 drinks. And they're like, yeah, sure. As if, like, you know, out of all the countries in Europe, Ukraine will win. I'm like, yeah, they're going to win. But that's as the tensions were rising. Yeah. And I could see the writing on the wall. So, yeah, I won some alcohol. So some people do profit from war.
Well, Ukraine's song was a bop anyway, so that's okay.
That's good. Yeah.
But side note.
Yeah, so the Labour government has always been like, well, Australia should be a republic. Australia needs to have its, as Paul Keating once said, our security in Asia rather than from Asia, that Jakarta should be our closest partner, not Washington, and that we need to be independent of the United States in order to craft our own way. And of course, unsurprisingly, that's something that China strongly supports, and that will revive that debate in our domestic politics. The other thing is that Australia's relationship with China in recent years has never been so bad. So there is a view that, you know, why are we provoking 1.5 billion people for the sake of the United States? Shouldn't we be just quiet about these things, maybe have these conversations behind closed doors, not grandstand, and have an improved relationship with China. Now, this was something that the Lithuanians, when I was in the Baltic, spoke with me about, and they said that while they definitely are against communism and support the rights of people in Hong Kong and Taiwan and the Uyghurs and so forth, they didn't like the fact that Landsbergis, the foreign minister, got up and grandstanded a lot. Would attack China publicly because the business sector suffered, but they were also blindsided by it. They were like, "Oh, I have a meeting with Chinese investors tomorrow. What are you doing?" And then the meetings, of course, would be cancelled. The Chinese would be like, "Why are you wasting our time? Your government is attacking us publicly." So this became a real issue. And that's certainly true for Australia as well. There's a lot of punishment of our sectors. Various sectors have suffered.
Wheat, I don't think.
Barley, yeah. Yeah, even coal has had some issues. So there's been problems there. And China has been saying, look, if you want to improve, you have to dial back the rhetoric and recognize some of our complaints.
Is that possible? Can we improve our relationship with China? Well, and still maintain a nice relationship with the US? Do we even want that relationship with the US to begin with? Okay,
so there's a lot of questions you've just asked, and each one of them have quite separate answers.
Oh, okay.
So, can our relationship with China improve? Well, the answer to that is to ask ourselves why the relationship deteriorated in the first place. And where I think the Labor government has it wrong is it's not Australia changed its attitude dramatically. Whatever the Liberal government or Conservatives had as a predisposition, the relationship changed because China changed. Prior to Xi Jinping, China was progressively opening. So you had Deng Xiaoping, you had Hu Jintao. People were opening up the country, not necessarily creating democracy or a modern Western state, but property rights was enshrined, the rights of investors, the rights of the judiciary. These things were progressively getting better, and China was opening up to different ideas and different ways of thinking, and less restrictions on speech, and like things were starting to change in a positive direction. And so Australia became economically dependent on China, probably too rapidly, but in an environment where things were improving. And so we could have candid discussions about rights and ways of doing things, and not have that flow into some putative mercantilist policy and trade practices. Whereas Xi Jinping has gone completely the other direction. He is dredging islands in the South China Sea and militarizing them. He has crushed Hong Kong. The Uyghurs are all interred. Taiwan, the rhetoric is incredibly inflammatory. The Great Firewall of China, like internet censorship, social credit system, It's a totalitarian nightmare in China. And so Australia hasn't changed. China has changed. And that's why our relationship has deteriorated, that we have kept to our values in an environment where China's values have become increasingly regressive and more threatening to the rest of the world. So no one wants Australia to have a bad relationship with China, but that's because China is becoming an expansive totalitarian state. And we have to ask ourselves whether it's worth becoming economically dependent on a country that is likely to be our enemy. And so I think the Lithuanians, in a great sense of moral valor and deep sense of fortitude, have, as a tiny country, realized that long before Australia ever did. And this is one big difference between the China of the 2000s, where we became dependent, and the China today. So in the 2000s, John Howard, a conservative prime minister, was the first one to really open up to China economically and massively expand our economic bilateral relationship. But that was in an environment where China's future seemed uncertain. There was a lot of people in the United States even that thought that economic growth in China would lead to a new middle class. That middle class would demand greater freedom because they'd have more education, more access to information, and that China, because the needs of economic growth would demand that political freedom come along with economic liberalization. At that time, a lot of people thought that democracy was a precondition for economic advancement, that you needed to have an open society, open systems of government to encourage innovation and investment. Now, one of the lessons of China's rise is that's not true. You can actually have economic growth and an authoritarian government. And we actually have a few countries like that, Singapore being another example. So it's not mandatory. So that was one thing that changed. But the other thing that changed is that because the future was uncertain, people thought they could be virtuous and get rich. Be like, oh yeah, we'll help China grow, and that'll make them more open. And so getting rich is actually us being virtuous, right? It was a very self-serving philosophy. Whereas the Europeans today have seen the direction China goes. So they're at the same point in the history as Australia was 15, 20 years ago. And for them, it's a moral choice. It's like, okay, we know China is a regressive totalitarian dictatorship and it's not going to get better. And the hostilities between China and the United States are going to get worse and worse. Should we become economically dependent on China, make ourselves rich, and pay the price for that? Australia is paying that price the hard way. So I don't think Australia should radically, debase itself in order to improve relations with China. I think, we should try to improve relations with China and keep that hand open. But I don't think we should kowtow towards China. I think China is extremely dangerous, and the United States is at great expense and risk to itself, trying to maintain the global commons. The sea should be free, the space should be free, the internet should be free, and it's American power that's underwritten that and created prosperity for all. So we should support the United States. In other words, I don't have a problem with improving relations with China. I don't have a problem with improving relations with Russia. But I do think we should maintain our principles and eyes open in doing so and not compromise on those core things that have created the division in the first place.
Okay. Sure. Okay. I'm trying to think of anything else to say, but
So Charlene?
Yes?
How exciting is this background here?
I think it's not very, but it's not forever.
No.
Yeah, so previously you've seen Baltic World go through so many transitions. We had a studio, then we did it to cut some costs, then we're on the road.
Yeah, so when we had the studio, we had dozens of lights, beautiful audio set up. We had little flags even in the apartment when we did that before. And yes, as Charlene says, we've been on the road, but...
Yes, but this is not forever, okay? We've found an apartment and we have designers in said apartment.
Right now, as we speak. So hopefully at the end of this recording, we'll even have some designs. And we gave them some directions as to inspiration, not be like, it must be this.
Yeah.
But what kind of directions did we give, Charlie?
Like a Witcher-esque theme. So we want to build it for Baltic World, essentially. Have some really cool Baltic memorabilia, have the flags, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you normally move into an apartment, you have you set up the things the way you want them to, and then you're like, okay, well, we need to do some recording for YouTube. So how are we going to make some changes to make that work? And in the old apartment, that was very much the case. We moved the things around and put some additional stuff in. Yeah. But really, it was living space, and we kind of had a makeshift studio. But this time, we'll have the bed up in the loft somewhere, and maybe a mattress on the bathroom floor. But the apartment will be designed for the studio. Yeah. So it's got to be Baltic theme. All the directions are around soundproofing and making sure that there's sort of amber and things like that, so people can recognize the branding. And if you have any ideas as to what you would like to see behind us in a well-lit, well-designed studio apartment for Baltic World exclusive content, let us know. Because but this is super exciting. Now it'll take a bit of time because it'll be completely refurbished. Yeah,
for sure. It's really exciting. No, I agree. It'll be refreshing to actually think about, wow, we can have like our own lighting, like inbuilt in this apartment, and perfect sound, and everything in between.
And I hope you guys like it because it's costing us a bit. This is our biggest investment in Baltic World since the beginning. So we are trying to have a visual experience. So when we do the recording, it's perfect. No mistakes. And it'll just be great setting. People will be able to turn it on and just enjoy what they see in the background rather than basically having this as a second screen while they're playing their games or whatever and listening just to the audio because they can't bear to look at it. That's what we do anyway. I don't know about you guys. And
it's actually really refreshing coming back from the Baltic to Australia. Like the Baltic trip was definitely worthwhile for myself because I actually never been to Europe but prior to the Baltic trip, and it's re-inspired me to basically jump in both feet into this project.
And there is a future in the Baltic, right? Yeah. Like the Baltic region, everybody who's been there from around the world knows it's underrated. It has beautiful people, beautiful landscapes, wonderful food. It's not over busy. The environment is gorgeous, and a great history and underrated culture. And so but eventually it will be discovered. And the challenge then is to stop it from being overrun, because you want to obviously have a nice tourism sector. You want to showcase it to the world, but you don't want to lose that identity that some places in Europe has. And we're such a great privilege to be part of that journey, being the internationals who can talk about the Baltic region and say, look, you guys are missing out if you haven't been there. And it was really relieving for me when Charlene went there and had that experience.
Yeah, and it was so great. Like, I was trying to convince my parents to come to the Baltic. And as soon as I landed back in Australia, Mum was like, next year? Next year, let's go. I'm like, sure. Because when she saw the video, she's like, it's beautiful. Why did I miss out on this experience? And I went to an ice cream shop. So side note. I went to an ice cream shop. And I think they're returning home to go see some family. They're from Holland. And I told them, I just recently came from the Baltic. And she was like, I love the Baltic. It's such an underrated place. Like, said the words out of my mouth. So I think, it's going to be a very exciting journey. Definitely.
Yeah, and we're also looking forward to back into regular content. Yes. So we're finally settled in. I've recovered from my illness. Finished traveling for the next couple of months. They've got one camping trip, but otherwise not much going on. And so we'll be able to do the reviews again. We'll be able to do our regular segments. Yes. And if there's any unusual topics, let us know. We've got a heavy one coming up on suicide in Lithuania because it has the highest rate in Europe still and one of the highest in the world. And we'll be doing a lot of research reading into why that is and some of how we could change that, because obviously it's a terrible tragedy and it's something we need to talk about, shine a light on it, not run away from it, and it's also high obviously in Latvia and to a lesser extent Estonia. That's coming up. We've got the history of Lithuania. So things are going to normalize now, hopefully, and I also have a video coming out shortly as well. It might even be released before this, depends which one we edit first. And yeah, it's...
I'm a keen being, so I actually look at my travel footage. I've sorted it, and I'm reliving like the Baltic trip again. It'd be good to go back and do one about all those pagan gods. Yeah, there's such cool videos coming up.
Yeah, the travel videos are going to be great.
Yeah.
They're going to be something else.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
I think that's all the time we have for today. Any questions, any feedback, leave them down below. Otherwise, stay safe and
ciao for now.